Good evening, everyone. I think we've got everybody in who's here. I want to thank everyone for signing up for a second night of Building Sustainable Communities. I want to introduce you and welcome you. My name is Bernie Wiesen. I'm with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County. And we are lucky enough to be entering into this series of building sustainable communities with some colleagues. And they are on the screen here. Christine Vanderland, if I can have you quickly show yourself. She's with the Hudson River Estuary Program. And we've got Haley Balenkoff from the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. So us three have been kind of working towards bringing this to the Capital District this year. And it is kind of an offshoot of what we've done in the past with our environmental roundtables. So this is the spin this year. So with that, again, I'm going to welcome you all for coming. I'm going to encourage you all to stay muted until we are to a point in our presentation where we're asking questions. At that point, I would encourage you to put a question in the chat so we can capture it. But additionally, encourage you to unmute and ask it verbally. I also want to say thank you to our speakers tonight. We're going to have two speakers. Our first one is going to be Megan Myers. She's with Soil and Water. She's the manager of our Soil and Water Conservation District here in Rensselaer County. And Kristopher Williams with Saratoga CCE. We're going to kick it off first with Megan Myers. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and we're going to turn everything over to Megan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Just going to get my screen on. Okay. How does that look to you guys?
Looks great, Megan.
Okay. Okay. Bernie asked me to talk a little bit quickly about the importance of buffers and native plants and creating sustainable and resilient landscapes. So I threw together a few slides for everyone. First, so speaking about native buffers, the importance of them, there's several reasons why buffers are important in our landscapes. Number one, water quality. Buffers help water quality, improve water quality, prevent or reduce sedimentation, and help control erosion. Native buffers are also important because of biodiversity. The native species can provide a lot more biodiversity in a planting and a plot buffer. And in addition to that, it's a combination. The best combination of a buffer is herbaceous species, vines, shrubs, and trees. A little bit from every variety in each stratum. And also productive soils. They help hold that topsoil together so there's not a lot of topsoil loss. So that topsoil can act as a filter and infiltrate storm water before it moves too far, and helps clean the water and promotes that water quality. Also a newer thing, buzz in my field is carbon sequestration, and we've been promoting that more nowadays, and there's certain trees out there that chestnuts are what I automatically think of. Chestnut trees, they help hold carbon in the soil and in their roots in the trees, to prevent carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere. They hold on to that. So there's a lot of buzz right now with promoting tree plantings, especially the ones that promote carbon sequestration. And for a really good buffer, it's really encouraged to, if you're in a natural resource, I'm thinking like a stream or a lake or a pond, the best size buffer is a 100-foot. There's a lot of research that I've read in years ago about, um, 100-foot helps with that water quality, and just allows, that stormwater to infiltrate and give a good habitat, and most productive that way. A little more in depth. So for water quality, the buffers, they reduce soil erosion from wind, rain, flooding, resulting in a decrease in the risk of land loss. And when I say that, I'm thinking, again, a buffer is very productive to have along a stream, which will promote that water quality. They help prevent sedimentation, like when you see like real muddy water, a buffer can help reduce that sedimentation in the water. And buffers help slow and infiltrate like stormwater runoff, carrying that sediment. And also the buffers will help slow down or stop nutrients and pollutants from getting into the water as well. Flood resiliency, areas that have those roots and those trees respond better, and have less impacts from flooding and heavy rainstorm events, which is, of course, increasingly more common now. Those roots from the vegetation, and it really doesn't have to be a tree, but that any, making sure that site is vegetated, that helps stabilize the site, and so that those soils aren't lost. And another, great impact from buffers and tree plantings are promoting wildlife habitat. Riparian buffers is they help with pollination. The tree canopy from those trees help shade and reduce, water temperatures and temperatures. They support cold water fisheries by keeping those waters cool along streams. Even fallen tree parts help from those tree buffers, and tree canopies provide a good, shelter and nesting sites for birds. So that's another um, good impact from buffers. And here's just wanted to show some pictures, and these are a couple projects from the last couple years from our district that we partnered with the Trout Unlimited, with the Home Waters chapter in our area. The first couple pictures are of a stream restoration project we completed, and this is in Rensselaer County, where the Post and Kill and Quack and Kill come together. And after we did our stream restoration project with working the stream, we did some rock veins and in the stream to reduce some or to stop some erosion from occurring. At the very end, Trout Unlimited was able to obtain a grant from DEC through, I think, the Trees for Tribs program, I believe. And so with Soil and Water and Trout Unlimited volunteers, we did a pretty good size tree planting on both sides of that stream and they're all native, to promote that stabilization and to help cool the waters over there, and help the habitat for both aquatic and terrestrial species over there. And the other two photos, it's the Post and Kill behind the Post Kill Firehouse. This past September, we finished a stream project over there, and we did some veins in the water to help reduce erosion. But when we were done, Soil and Water has an annual tree sale. We had some trees left over from the year before. And so when this project was done, we donated our trees and we planted them here along the stream bank, in addition to hydroseeding it to help restore this area. And it was the Trout Unlimited that we partnered with for this project, and it was their volunteers that did all the tree plantings, actually. So we try to take an opportunity to do buffer plantings, primarily riparian buffer plantings, when we can, usually on an annual basis. But we are always looking for new sites to do riparian buffer plantings. So please reach out to me if you have a site in mind that might work. This is just a quick sample of another grant opportunity that a project that we completed a couple years ago. It was a planting on a farm for chestnuts in Rensselaer County. But the main goal was it was a soil conservation or soil health project, which really incorporated that climate resiliency project with carbon sequestration, because they were chestnuts. And also, these chestnuts are great, not just because of that. Wildlife loves chestnuts. They're one of the go-tos for wildlife. The project also incorporated like wildlife structures, and in that middle picture you can see that's a perch that was implemented in the middle of the chestnut planting, which was a 20-acre site of chestnuts that were planted. And you can see there's I think it's a hawk that's perched on that structure that was implemented there. So that was a pretty neat tree planting project through a grant with Ag and Markets. And lastly, I just wanted to share with everyone that we do. So like I mentioned, we have an annual tree and shrub sale every April. They're all natives, but some are like hybrids, not, some people get a little particular in what they want. But in general, they're service berries, oaks, maples, birches, apple trees, pear trees, some dogwoods for like wetter areas, and willows. We just finished our tree sale last weekend. It was a big success. So feel free to follow us and reach out to us if that for that time of year, if you're looking for some trees or shrubs to purchase. And lastly, just to throw out there, if there are folks that want to do some tree plantings, but they don't have the equipment, they want to do a large plot, we do have a tree planter that we share for a price. It's free delivery, free pickup. Christmas tree farms use them, but not just Christmas tree farms. You can put, like 18-inch sized trees through the planter, and you can plant quite a bit. So keep that in mind. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. I know there's a couple, there's one question in the chat. One question is, when you say buffer, do you mean a hedgerow?
When I say buffer, I'm thinking of an area, it's like 100 foot wide area. Usually in my experience, it's adjacent or adjacent to a natural resource. Even though I think a buffer anywhere is worth having, but I personally I'm thinking of 100 foot wide offset from a natural resource.
Thank you. And there is someone who is watching who put in the chat that they did not see nice to see speaker but can't see pictures. So I just want to encourage you all to fiddle with your own screens because you should be able to adjust those. As a host, we have enabled people to share their screens and they are minimizing the pictures of the presenters. So you should be able to adjust, and I know that can be hard, especially if you're on small devices. Okay, any other questions for Megan before we move to our next speaker? Okay, seeing none. Megan, thank you very much.
Welcome.
All right, our next speaker is Kristopher Williams from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Saratoga. So I'm going to turn it right on over to Kristopher. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Bernie. And can you folks see the presentation that I have up for sustainable landscapes?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Megan, really nice. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Megan does a lot of wonderful work with those riparian corridors and buffers. I'll probably throw some links in before we're done, but one of those is the Hudson River viewing shed from the Hudson River Estuary Program would be worth sharing. I have that queued up, but I'll get that out. So welcome everyone. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about a lot of things as a quick overview with sustainable landscapes, integrated pest management, and invasive species. I will also encourage folks to take screenshots. If you see resources, I might indicate that this is a good thing that you can look up. You can do that on your phone. You can, if you know how to, you can probably do a print screen on your computer. And I will share this presentation as a PDF with Bernie so she can share it if anybody's interested. So I'm Kristopher Williams. I am the Capital Region Coordinator for the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. There are 8 PRISMs in New York State. We are all fully funded by the New York State DEC, and we're administering on contracts for the divisions of lands and water for ecosystem health. It is truly a magnificent job. It is a very busy job. But we have a staff of 5 full-time employees, and we hire up to 16 seasonal workers to deploy programming all across the capital region. We work out of 11 counties. Rensselaer is one of them, for example. Tonight, I wanted to talk about empowering community members, conservation practitioners to apply conservation practices on small scales to provide ecosystem benefits. Normally I do this program, it's almost like a 3-hour program as a workshop. I sometimes break it up into 2 classes. So I'm really going to kind of touch on invasive species tonight and a little bit about integrated pest management. I do have another presentation where I really get into like the nitty-gritty of how to restore landscapes, even if it's in your backyard or if it's in your community forest. And so tonight, I have a broad spectrum of an audience here, which is fine. I'm sure everyone tonight will walk away with a few key concepts that they can use. So I'm going to just give a really quick overview about invasive species, but just for the record, these are species that are non-native to the continental United States. They have the potential to cause harm to the environment, economy, and human health. These are plants, animals, viruses, and pathogens that did not originate from this area, so they haven't co-evolved with other species, and they basically have competitive advantages that sometimes push our native flora and fauna into extinction. Just really not good things. Not all invasive species are extremely high threat or aggressive, but the ones that we do have, they are very notable. And also there's a huge cost associated with invasive species for just prevention, education, outreach, early detection, and then control and management, which is very difficult once that genie is out of the bottle to put back in. So a couple terminologies to help break this down for people. When you go to a home and garden shop or a grower, a lot of times folks are buying ornamental species that are coming from other locations. These are not necessarily invasive species. They just happen to be cultivars that are sought after. They might be showy, flowery. They may have a lot of advantages for doing very well in droughty conditions, maybe not need so much water, and maybe they bloom early, they last longer in the season. And so those are ornamental species. However, we have learned that sometimes these ornamentals do wake up and they tend to start spreading into our environment. You might find them along our roadside edges, they escape our gardens, they start infiltrating our backyards. At that point, we consider them naturalized species. Not that they're doing anything wrong or anything harmful, they're just spreading. So with the onset of climate change, what we are seeing is some of these ornamental species are waking up and they are behaving aggressively. These in our office, we call them sleeper species. They've now crossed that realm where they're no longer just an ornamental or they're naturalized. They are actually doing harm to the environment. And then we're documenting that, hey, we have this new threat that's appearing based on our environmental conditions. And anytime, again, that they can rapidly reproduce and then displace other native species or cause harm, we're going to label them invasive species. All right, this is worth a screenshot for you folks that may be interested in, hey, I'd like to know if this is an invasive species. Is it found in my area? The New York State Natural Heritage Program with the other prisms in New York State have created a tier list. And in that tier list, they've defined these species for folks that are interested in maybe looking them up, identifying them, and finding out if they're close to their area. So I did a screenshot real quick. This is the Capital Region Prism. If you click on terrestrial plants, and then you have these tiers here. And what that means is a tier 1 invasive species is not found in New York. Okay, we're aware of it, we're monitoring it, we're putting out notices that this is something that we should be looking for. A tier 4 invasive species is found everywhere. Common reed, Japanese knotweed. We find that everywhere. We do our best work with tier 2 species. These are populations that are less than 10 in locations throughout like Eastern New York. They're in low levels, low abundance, easy to manage, cost effective to remove. It's when they become tier 3 and 4, they're widespread, then the cost of control becomes really high. So this is a nice website for checking out just the classification of invasive species. For example, more cork tree, if you were to click on this, it would take you to IMAP invasives, and it would show you the locations of reported species. It says it has a high ecological threat. There's no socioeconomic value. It's not sold in nurseries, so it doesn't have any cost benefit for capital margin. And you can see in New York, it's found everywhere, tier 4, but in our region, it's a tier 2 species. It has most often been planted as a street tree, so it's in low-level populations. Here's another one if you have a chance to take a picture or jot down this name. If you're looking for a fairly decent resource to identify invasive species and give you some general information on control, the Plant Invaders of the Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas Field Guide is fantastic. This was a resource that is federally funded. If you Google the name, it will come up and you do a little search. You can actually download it as a PDF for free. You can purchase it for under like $10. This is the most current reprint. I highly recommend it for those of you that want to know more than just your entry or common invasives. It gives you a little bit more detail and a little bit more selection of species, but it is a very great resource. So again, Plant Invaders of the Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas Field Guide is a great resource. All right, some things to know to set the tone here. All of the invasive species, we're aware of them. We've identified them. We know what plants, animals, and insects are problematic. In terms of plants that are sold in the horticultural industry, outside of New York, 61% of all known invasive species are still sold in the United States. We know that these plants are problematic, but they are still sold outside of New York State. And most of us, just so you know, you can still buy things online. It's really hard to regulate internet sales. And sometimes these things do show up in our local nurseries. So this is one of the problem areas. We are the source for introducing invasive species, not always, but a lot of times through purchasing, and then they escape our environment and become naturalized. Another really great resource, the Risk Network for Invasive Species Research and Connectivity, these guys are great. They have these fact sheets for people that really break down some research that's easier to digest for people. And I'm just, again, setting the foundation here for consideration. On the picture here on the left, they're showing like a forest, an ecosystem, a habitat, a community of a landscape that's dominated by non-native plants. And what the researchers have found that these plants basically are not used by arthropods or other animals. And so they have low ecological function. They're not used by other critters in nature. And so what happens, the pollinators, the caterpillars, they don't have the digestive enzymes, the mouth parts, they're not eating, feeding, they're not using these non-native plants, these invasive plants. And what happens is we see a reduction in the bird populations. So the primary producers decrease in the presence of high abundance of non-native invasive species, causing these food chain issues and reductions in our biodiversity. Where we have native plants on the right, when they do research, they tend to see that there are high counts of arthropods, caterpillars, pollinators, and then subsequently, these other birds of prey their counts are even higher. So there's a really strong correlation there between, non-functioning, non-native invasive plants and native plants and how they are a really good resource for our ecology. A really quick breakdown. If you were to look at like a ginkgo tree, which I love ginkgo trees, I have 3 on my property. They are not invasive. However, they're not from this continent, so they're not really ecologically functioning. They don't provide ecosystem services. So there was a study that looked at a ginkgo tree, golden rain tree, and a Moramachia. And what they found, there was only 5 arthropods using those 3 trees combined. Okay, so there wasn't a lot of function there. If you take a white oak tree, Quercus albus, typically when you do a little research and you look at all the insects, bugs, and animals using Quercus albus, just white oak, around 300 insects, birds, and animals use that single tree species. When we look at the whole suite of oaks, pin oak, scarlet oak, red oak, white oak, all of them together, they support over 4,000 different species of insect and animals. And to bring this concept home, when we're looking at chickadees, a single clutch to be raised need approximately 7,500 caterpillars to be raised. And if you don't have those native species present, you have bird species collapse, bird count collapses. And so this is just a small picture of how pollinators, insects, and birds are related and the negative impacts associated with invasive species. And I find that this is a tool that really helps people understand the importance to select native species, or at least range expansion species in the Northeast for planting, for those repairing corridors, for those buffers, for restoration, or just planting in your yard as a specimen. So I also have this resource here if you want to take a picture of this with your phone. The Audubon Society has a web page that you can actually put in your zip code and it will tell you native species that will grow in your area. Same with the National Wildlife Federation, the Xerces Society, and right on down the list. And of course, you can always contact your Soil and Water Conservation District or your Cornell Cooperative Extension for their plant cells. But this is a list of resources where you can find information on native plants that are beneficial and productive for your environment. I'm going to go very quick. So here's the Audubon one. You put your zip code in, and then they give you these little ID cards of like, here is a pussy willow. Okay. Here are the species that it will actually support. And it's really cool. It generates these plant lists, and it's very well done. I love it. It's great. The Xerces Society, absolutely amazing. They've got this all dialed in. If you want resources that you want to download that are easily digestible, please go to the Xerces Society. They give these spreadsheets here. They'll have stuff for like, I think this one I took was for the Northeast in general of this area. It has plant lists, like for example, red maple. It shows you the form, sun, soil, but then additional details about the species it supports. And it gives a little key here to help you understand the benefits of planting natives versus non-natives. More detail, if you really want to get into planting meadows from seed or creating habitat from plugs, they have 2 wonderful downloadable resources that are free for you to use as a guide, very comprehensive. I do encourage people that if you're like, oh, this is interesting, I kind of want to look at these, I would do so rather quickly because they are federally supported and they are currently being shut down or at risk of being shut down. Some of the websites that we use in our line of work have been basically there's a 404 error. This page cannot be used anymore. And again, there are other resources out there. I gave you that slide. I'll provide them, but just some really great information out there. You don't have to do the homework. And I also want to give a plug for the New York Floral Atlas. If you put a species in here and look up the common name or scientific name, you can generate a list. For this one, I think I just put in acre and it generated all the maples. One thing I want to point out here, like a Norway maple, this is a non-native species. It will tell you it's non-native. There's an option to click on for this conservation coefficient. It has no ecological services, so it doesn't have a score. It's typically like a 0 for invasives. Where if I take a look at something like a black maple tree, it is native and it has a high conservation coefficient out of 10. It gets an 8 out of 10, meaning it supports a lot of insects, arthropods, etc., pollinators, and other animals. And so I typically choose these plant types that have the higher scores when I'm doing restoration, depending on the region. Again, I can't get into everything tonight. It's a lot. So those are resources I want to point out to you. All right, so in the next part of my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about invasive species management. The end product of doing that is restoration, which I provided the resources first. What I'm going to show you here is mildly technical, but I'm going to explain it in terminology that if you're a landowner, you own your own woodlot, you can take parts of this and create a plan or give you a pathway for thinking about how to handle these problematic species that you may not want on your properties. So, and it goes the same if there's any conservation managers on the webinar tonight. This is just kind of a simplistic diagram that we use where if we have a location and I have a property and we have invasive species on that property, first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set some goals about management. And management can come in a lot of different forms, which I'll touch on. But basically, I'm going to let you know that it's okay if you don't manage invasive species. It's okay if some of them on your property stay, but maybe you have a goal where I'd like to take care of this common reed or this Japanese knotweed. Maybe you'd like to remove honeysuckle, but there's other invasives. That's okay. But by setting a goal, a realistic goal of what you want to do will help you be more successful in the long run. For example, if I have an acre of honeysuckle, and in that acre, there's like 40 plants, I may not be able as a single person to go out and like remove them in a weekend. That's not a practical goal. But if I set a goal, like maybe I'd like to reduce that population by 50% over the next year or 2 years, that's a realistic goal. And then choosing the species that I'm most concerned about. And that's number 2, prioritizing species. So certain plants are not as aggressive as others when it comes to invasive species. So you may want to take a look at identifying what you have on your property and then looking up on that New York Natural Heritage tier list, like what species is a bigger threat on my property? Which one's going to be more problematic over time? Some invasive species, purple loosestrife, right, grows in the ditches, near roadsides. It has a biocontrol that keeps it pretty well curbed. I may not want to spend my time knowing that there's a biocontrol, a bug that eats it and keeps the populations down. However, something like common reed, Phragmites, if it shows up and I got a little parcel of it that's maybe like the size of my bathroom, probably going to want to spend my energies removing that because it's in low abundance, in a small population, and it's a very aggressive plant, and it's in a manageable size that I can take care of. So that's where developing a site plan, number 3, comes in, is a lot of these plants, you can look them up online, like how to control common reed. What are the best management practices for common reed? Actually going to an accredited institution, looking up the information on how to control it using different types of integrated pest management, from using a shovel, covering it, smothering it. Are chemical controls a viable option? That's all IPM, but you want to have a plan. Going out and just trying to steamroll it with whatever resources you have without doing the research is a really bad idea. Identify the plant, know its characteristics, understand its best practices to have it controlled. So once you kind of have like a prioritization, you know what you want to go after, you have a plan, you looked up some best management practices, then go ahead and implement it. And don't anticipate you're going to be 100% successful with a one and done. It doesn't work that way. It does not work that way. Typically in our line of work, we may address manually or mechanically using like tools or shovels an infestation depending on the plant, something where we might actually go out and say, okay, we want to reduce the population by 25% the first time. Maybe we want to reduce the seeds by removing the flower heads. The second treatment in that year, maybe we want to reduce it by another 10%. So we typically look at managing some of these invasive species multiple times in a year over a 1 to 3 year period, depending on the size. And then the last part is to monitor and assess what's going on. If you're doing something and you're removing a plant and it's just not going away, then it's time to reevaluate what you're doing. Is there another approach? We call that adaptive management. All right, so integrated pest management, IPM, is an adaptive ecosystem-based approach exploring multiple control options to target an invasive species. Typically speaking, the best approach is using a multi-tiered approach. And it also will depend on maybe the size of the infestation. I'm not going to go out with a shovel and anticipate that I'm going to remove 100 acres of honeysuckle with a shovel. It's not the right tool for that size. However, if I have like 2 or 3 honeysuckle infestations, a couple bushes here and there, that might be appropriate. And it may not just involve like using a shovel and trying to dig up the roots. It might also involve cutting or doing a high stump cut. It might involve digging up some. It might be attacking like the outside parcels. It might actually be, part of it might be using some chemical controls. But the goal is to maximize the effective control and minimize the negative environmental, economic, and social impacts. A lot of times IPM, integrated pest management, is determined by the resources, the funds that you have, the time, and people power, right? So it all depends on a lot of those other factors for the level of success you have. This triangle is really cool. It really explains IPM well. The foundation are cultural controls for controlling unwanted, undesirable vegetation, in this case, invasive species. A cultural control could be something like a prevention measure. A lot of our invasive species are brought on properties from unclean equipment or unclean fill. So sometimes people bring in mulch, or they might bring in some rocks for their driveway, and there's propagules of plants, seeds, and parts that are in those that will actually spread onto their property. So there's methods where you can clean equipment, like, if there's a tractor that shows up on your property, cleaning shovels that were on another property where there was invasive species. Those are really simple cultural controls. Prevention is one of them. Another one would be to plant more natives, to use cover crops. Invasive species claim disturbed soil very quickly because they typically flower sooner than our natives. So, our farmers are really good at using cover crops. They know if they don't put something down, they're going to have undesirable vegetation moving in. So those are cultural controls. When you have small infestations, typically, maybe something 1/10 of an acre, maybe a few stems here and there, that's where like using shovels and hand tools come into play. However, if your populations get a little larger, then you start looking at mechanical methods. Maybe I need a brush cutter. Maybe I need some hedge trimmers or small chainsaws. Biological controls, we use them in our natural resources. They are typically not available to local, residents. However, they can buy some that have been released in New York. A lot of times it's your researchers, your academic institutions, your government agencies that are releasing biocontrols. There are plenty out there doing their job, and they are successful. They have undergone rigorous testing. Chemical controls, though, are at the top, and notice it's the smallest part of the triangle. These should be the last resort. They should be used very restrictively, and they should be used according to the product label. If I have time tonight, I will show you some quick, easy methods where you introduce chemicals to target a selective plant, in which you're using minuscule amounts of herbicide to control a very high threat species. In our line of work, we use chemical controls to protect rare, threatened, and endangered species or species of concern. So we have this really nice balance between what we're doing as practitioners applying chemicals while trying to restore or protect our environment. The chemical controls that we use in our line of work are not like the chemical controls that you see in the agricultural industry for like protecting seed stock, seed sources, or the fertilizers and herbicides that are used on our overly green lawns. Those are our two biggest sources of chemical release in our environment. So I kind of briefly touched on manual and mechanical controls. Again, hand pulling, grubbing, cutting, girdling, grazing, hoeing, mowing, and excavating. There are different tools, different techniques. Sometimes in workshops, I bring all these tools and show people like how you use them when something's rhizomatous or has a lot of root structure, or what's the best tool for doing this job. But those are your manual and mechanical controls. These also include barrier techniques, even mulching or using cardboard. You can sometimes smother certain types of grasses. Biological controls are natural enemies like predators, parasites, pathogens, and competitors to feed on or disrupt the invasive species that's not desired. And then chemical controls are pesticides that are selected and applied in a way that minimizes the possible harm to people, non-target organisms, and the environment. Yeah, there's a picture of me removing hogweed on the New York State Thruway. This is a plant. It's a high threat because it really causes nasty burns. You can see what I'm doing is I have a pair of loppers, and I am actually removing the umbel or the seed head so that they're not dispersed. That's a form of management, not necessarily killing the plant, but just removing the seed head. After we remove the umbel, we usually take a shovel and then root spade the root, and that's it. One and done, over. Okay, so that's different ways of treating things using, some cultural practices to remove the seeds for further spread, and then using a shovel just to remove them. If you have hogweed or see it, this is something that you're probably better off doing a little research before you remove it on private property. Also, chemical controls would be appropriate here, just spraying them because it's such a high threat plant and not risking a chemical burn, just sometimes giving them a foliar application to remove that from growing and spreading in the environment. Here's a really nice diagram. This sometimes gives people a little, like a different level of strategy for success. So I kind of tell people like, well, if you can't control all of it, maybe you consider reducing the spread through some cultural practices. So this could be any invasive species. I'll just pick on Japanese barberry. Okay. You might have a location in your understory or in your field where it's really thick and really dense. Maybe it's just 1/10 of an acre, but it's just something you can't tackle at the moment for whatever reason. But then you have all of these little satellite populations that have spread from seed dispersal away from the central cluster. These we call, again, our satellite populations, and making a plan with that goal in mind. Well, I want to reduce 25%. We'll start with the outside satellite populations to prevent it from spreading further on your property. We sometimes call this suppression, but it is a tool to actually curb and reduce the impact of that invasive. Over time, in multiple treatments, you then can start to attack the central cluster or the core infestation. So that's a really nice tool or a concept for managing and prioritizing on how you're going to actually maybe remove a species. So again, I had briefly touched on this small infestations, usually 1/10 of an acre to an acre, depending on the species. This is when you have your manual and mechanical controls. Your medium infestations, almost up to 2.5 acres, depending on the number of people present. You can still use manual controls, but you really need to start looking at tools. And then large infestations, you might have to use mechanized equipment, like forestry brush cutters, brush hogs, chemical foliar applications. Each size of an infestation determines its actual method for treatment. All right. This will get me into trouble because I've lumped species together, and the word is most of the species on this slide can be managed the same way, but not always. It also depends on if it's a mature plant, it's in seed. There's so many things to consider because you don't want to be removing plants, dragging them around where they're loaded with seeds, because then you're spreading it. So there's a whole bunch of other things you got to consider. But in general, woody vines, shrubs, trees, and most herbaceous plants can be managed physically in small populations by hand removal, cutting, mowing, girdling, double girdling, triple girdling. You can do prescribed grazing with goats. It's not always that easy doing that. It's kind of novel. Burning's great, except for burn bans and then burn permits. That's usually best left to your resource practitioners. Think of the Albany pine bush and other places like that. And you can do heat treatments with flame torches, okay? Then there's combined controls, like where you cut the stump and then you just paint a little herbicide on it. Or you can girdle it and paint some herbicide so it gets in the cambium and pulled into the plant. There's things called stem injection. On the other end, you start to get a little messy when you have those foliar applications where you're spraying, because sometimes you can get broadcast and non-target species. But in general, most woody vine shrubs and trees can be treated using these techniques. Here's a quick list of all those woody vines: honeysuckles, buckthorn, barberry, multiflora rose. Those are really common. Autumn olive. Those are some different methods to do that. And a lot of fact sheets that you look up will give highly specific recommendations on how to do this. This is a quick list of your herbaceous plants and vines. They're a little bit more difficult. Vines are tough. You really want to attack the roots. Sometimes in small infestations, you can pull them. You can grub them. Other times, if you can't get all of them, you might try to remove as many as you can by pulling, digging, grubbing. Maybe you have a couple that are resistant. You cut and then a little spray of herbicide to get that last 10%. Trees, Japanese tree lilac is highly invasive. It's pretty. Angelica tree is really high threat, but your Norway maples and tree of heaven are really common in the capital region. They're very problematic. But I would be really aggressive with removing any new saplings that you might find of these species on your property. So I'm going to go a little quicker now at 7:49. I'm going to wrap up. When I talk about, I'm just going to show pictures. When I talk about grubbing, digging, these hand trowels are amazing for pulling up roots. Highly recommend buying a high quality product one for just removing some species here and there, maybe small, abundant, small populations, 1/10 of an acre. They are great because you can kind of chop and hoe at the same time to remove the root system while pulling them up. When you get plants that are a little bit bigger, we sometimes do this. This is called a high stump cut. And by doing this, I typically do this work in the winter time. We remove the overburden of this honeysuckle, so there's no leaves and no vegetation to deal with. I've severely damaged the plant. It has a lot of stored carbohydrates in the root system. It will reflush and resucker, but it's going to use a lot of energy to do that. It will not flower. It will not go to seed because I've injured the plant. I might then come back in and give a second cut lower. And sometimes we get lucky, and in a high temperature, droughty conditions, it just dies. So this is a lot easier than digging up the root ball. It's just like a repetitive cutting to actually kill the plant. Now, if I was really desperate, I could go and then paint with a paintbrush on the cambium in a circle and just wick on some herbicide to actually kill the plant and finish it off if I chose to do that. So that's IPM on a single plant. One of the things when you use chemicals, timing is important because you want to have the chemical application after a plant is flowered. So in the spring, we got our plants that are flushing out their new buds and they push the chemicals away. But after a plant flowers or goes to seed, it's then taking the carbohydrates from the leaves and pulling them back into the root system, and it brings or translocates those chemicals into the root system. So it's a really great tool. Of course, we have mowing and cutting. You can use these forestry brush cutters. These are around $800, but when you have those larger infestations, really good tool to use. And again, this is a suite of tools that you could use on smaller infestations. In other cases, which are really obtrusive, we might use a forestry brush cutter. This is not for everyone. It's highly disruptive to the environment. However, these are areas that you then consider restoration immediately after. Getting a cover crop down with native seedlings and species through seeds or plantings is the way to go. All right, so I'm going to finish with just this slide here. It is 7:52 and I'll answer questions. So I was trying to introduce these really novel approaches to using chemicals as a last resort. So if you look on the bottom picture, this is like a scraping technique where you take a knife and you just remove some of that, outer bark, and then you just wick on or paint some herbicide for those really difficult or very aggressive invasive species. There's another technique called drill and fill, where you actually drill holes in a diameter pattern and you introduce a few milliliters of diluted herbicide to kill a plant. The old method was called this hack and squirt. And you can see in the upper picture, there's a treatment there where they're just applying an herbicide to the cambium to kill the root so it doesn't grow back. All right, that was a short overview of part 1 of my sustainability and invasive species presentation. There's certainly more. But I don't have time for all that tonight. You're always welcome to invite me back. But I just wanted to give you a quick overview to help you with some basic conservation tools and tips to help you out on your yard. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. And I now can see the chat box. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, Bernie.
There is one question. Do you have a list of sleeper species?
So that New York Natural Heritage Program diagram that I showed you, okay, the tier list. Let me see if I can find it again. There is a list. There's over 400 species. Yeah. I'm not at will to share that at this moment, but what I can tell you, let me see, share screen. I'm doing it real quick. A lot of the species that are in here, when you do a search, and they're going to have them by alphabetical order, and you can look them up. So these, do I have the old one? There's one that says prohibit it and regulate it. Sorry, this is an old one. There's an extra column now. The prohibited and regulated ones are the ones that are not for sale or have warnings, but they list all the other ones on this site. You can look them up. They're there. So if you were like, many people don't know, like Vinca, like Myrtle is invasive. They don't know that. You can but they're not regulated, you can find those species in this resource. Okay, and that's the New York State Invasive Species Tiers List, brought to you by the New York Natural Heritage Program. Other questions or comments?
I don't see any others in the chat, but people feel free to unmute and ask away.
I did see one that just popped up in the
Oh, yeah,
chat.
I see that too.
It's a good one. First, I'm going to emphasize that if you're doing any work within 100 feet of a waterway, that you would want to contact your New York State DEC permitting office, because if it's in a wetland, there are regulations that you need to apply a permit for. Okay, so that's step one when talking about using chemicals. When you're managing plants, if there's small infestations in a riparian corridor, you're probably fine if it's less than 20. But if you start getting into like, I need to remove 100 plants, you should really contact your New York State DEC permitting office, because they might have some prescriptions or guidelines for you to follow. You can always reach out to your soil and water conservation district, or you can reach out to your local PRISM to guide you on some of that steps. But there is a lot of work you can do in those areas. You just can't go willy-nilly and just start spraying chemicals or doing really massive amounts of work in those riparian corridors. We don't want soil erosion, turbidity issues, disrupting the stream. And you really need to have like a prescription before you do that work. But again, removing a couple here and there, doing a restoration project, it all depends on the scale of your work. Kate, you had your hand up.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So I wanted to talk a little bit about like when you were talking about cover cropping, because in my experience, like if you don't put something else there, it seems like the invasive just come back.
So it's a little tricky. We don't restore the landscape right away.
Okay.
It depends. So like if we have an area that's really fouled, it's really just degraded by invasive species, we might manage that site for, 5 or 6 times in a year. We might manage that same location 3 or 4 times in year 2, and maybe 3 or 4 in year 3. Because we're in and out of there and we're removing, and it's really detrimental. So we tend to reduce the burden to a specific point that we feel, okay, now it's a good time. But we don't like to leave bare soil either. So if there are residual, like, I'm just going to put it out there, goldenrods, Joe Pye weed, if there are native species that are present, we will flag them at a work site and we retain them. Like, don't touch, because what happens is they're prolific seeders, and we will actually go in the fall at our work sites and we'll break up the seeds pods and actually distribute them in the area. And we often find that they come back pretty aggressively the following season as a cultural control to suppress any seeds that might germinate. So it is a good practice. But then you have the issue, like you might have 20% of this invasive spread out, surrounded by all these natives, and it makes it more difficult to get them. But it's still a good practice, and it can be successful. And it's okay to live with some invasives. It's just as long as you're starting to get that benefit on your return. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Question on hemlock woolly adelgid. Forest pests are very difficult to control. The resources that are needed to do that are rather expensive. In our work, we are treating chemical applications on public lands where we've prioritized hemlock trees to be of significant value, meaning they might be old growth trees that support rare and endangered species, or they're in a watershed that will protect critical watershed. I had a phone call today with a local homeowner. She has something like 70 trees in Saratoga that are infested with HWA. And the best I could do is provide her a chemical applicators list, a professional service where she could pay to have a portion of her trees protected. The U.S. Forest Service for conservation management, if you have the resources available, is recommending conserving 10% of those hemlock trees if you can do it. So unfortunately, like the emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, there's like chestnut blight. These forest pathogens are very aggressive when they are a host on one single tree. It's detrimental. So one of the things we go back to is, prevention. Let's not move firewood. Let's not introduce more insects to our environment. On the flip side, hemlock woolly adelgid has multiple biocontrols that have been released in New York State. We do that in our office. One of the biocontrols has been very successful at taking. You need two, though. There's a beetle that is working very well. We're working on this silverfly with the New York State Hemlock Initiative. You can look that up. Maybe somebody can throw that in the chat. The silverfly, they're still releasing it. We're just trying to find out if it is successfully overwintering. Hemlock woolly adelgid has 2 hatches a year. The one biocontrol, the beetle, eats it in the winter, but there's still some eggs around and they hatch again. We're trying to get the silverfly, but biocontrols take a very long time to become established, but there is hope there. In the meantime, we are actually conducting surveys for lingering hemlock trees. And when we identify these trees, we're taking basically grafts or scions to a lab for them to start reproducing. Kind of like the American chestnut program, but on a really fast track. So that's the best I can do to answer your question. As a homeowner, there used to be some chemicals in the big box retail stores. I think they've been removed from the shelves from basically legislative action in New York State to curb some of these neonicotinoids. But I think they didn't do a very good job of thinking about how they were removing them and for what purpose. Your best bet is to contact a tree service that does that work. Other questions or comments?
Looks like we're dried out on these questions. Please note, everyone, you will be receiving, I want to say, actually, thank you, Kristopher, for the great information and the great presentation. I want to let everybody know that there will be a follow-up email that will provide a link for this recording. And as Kristopher mentioned, he will be providing to me a PDF of his presentation that I will also send out, so you have access to that. So with that, if there are no other questions, I'm going to say thank you to Megan and Kristopher again for the great presentations, and say have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you for the opportunity, Bernie. Thank you,
You're welcome.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you. Oh, I will mention we have one more installation next Thursday. Not too late to sign up.